Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Alastair.
And I'm Nick.
And in today's episode, we will be discussing Nomadland, the Best Picture Oscar-winning film from Chloe Zhao, starring Frances McDormand. And then we'll be looking at Way of X, a new X-Men comic from Cy Spurrier and Bob Quinn. But before all of that, Nick, do you have something to recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, since we're back in the murky waters of comics, I have also been reading the recent run on Silver Surfer by Dan Slott and Michael and Laura Allred, which came out, I think, sort of second half of the 2010s, over about 3 or 4 years. They did about 30 issues, which I think you can possibly now get in a single massive hardback, if that's your bag, but I just read them on Marvel Unlimited. But yeah, this is... I'm honestly never sure if Silver Surfer is one of these characters I can just assume everyone's familiar with. How many of us saw Fantastic Four 2 Rise of the Silver Surfer? I certainly didn't.
I did not see that film either, although I do remember him from the Fantastic Four 90s cartoon that they did.
Yeah, Fantastic Four character Silver Surfer is the Herald, the sort of sidekick, hype man setup dude for the planet-eating monster Galactus, whose job was to turn up to planets and go, Galactus, you can eat this one. And eventually he started feeling bad about this, and now he flies around having space adventures on his surfboard, because he's basically a man who looks like a silver Oscar statue on a silver surfboard. It's a very simple but effective Jack Kirby design. Yes, he's one of these characters who comes out every few years at Marvel when someone has a new concept for how to make him work, and Dan Slott did this in the 2010s with a version that is, to put it mildly, a little bit Doctor Who inflected, but I mean, it's so obvious I think it has to come under loving homage, where the Silver Surfer meets a young woman called Dawn while he's on Earth, and they have a connection, so he sort of adopts her as his companion, and it starts taking her on journeys to exciting new worlds. And it is, again, all very Doctor Who companion. Specifically, it's very Russell T Davies Doctor Who, to a degree that, yeah, it's a very, very well done comic, primarily. It's beautifully drawn. Michael Allred has a very distinctive sort of retro-looking pop art style, which, yeah, if you know what Michael Allred art looks like, you can see it as soon as it appears. He's a guy who's got a very clear look, and it's very clean, it's very attractive. He's very good at doing character emotions within it. His panels are nearly always, like, not just good storytelling, but often cool-looking images in their own right. He's a great artist, and it's honestly worth reading this just for the art. But the story is also pretty charming, as long as you're okay with a certain level of Doctor Who homaging. It does get more Doctor Who as it goes along. There's some really hard Doctor Who action in towards the end. It's a very... I guess I shouldn't spoil it, but if you've seen some of the Doctor Who and his companion go their separate ways episodes from the recent incarnations of Doctor Who, then the ending of this series will seem very familiar. But yes, it is a very, very good comic. If the idea of a Doctor Who-esque Silver Surfer appeals to you, then it's an excellent rendition of that. Really, really good.
Interesting that Doctor Who's had such an impact. I guess it is an iconic way to formulate a sci-fi story.
I mean, yeah, I think the Silver Surfer, as I say, is one of these guys who's always around in the background of events, and every so often he has a series, but he's never been one of the mainstays. So they've never quite found a way of doing constant Silver Surfer stories. I mean, this version doesn't seem to have entirely caught on either. Like, they didn't immediately do another volume along the same lines, which I guess would have depended on another team wanting to come on and also do it, and I think Dan Slott just really loves Doctor Who. But yeah, it's an interesting way of breathing a bit of new life into the Silver Surfer character by importing these elements from Doctor Who, and although it is fairly obvious what he's doing, it does work. The character does suit that. He's got this sort of, like, because of his aforementioned background being the ground team for Galactus, and, you know, being somewhat responsible for lots of whole worlds being eaten, it makes it quite easy to play him in a sort of Christopher Eccleston-esque, quiet, haunted man way.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, actually, that it sounds very much like the first series of, you know, Russell T Davies Doctor Who, when there's a sort of this real sense of darkness and trauma lurking in the background, which sort of faded as time went by. Yeah,
it's very much about the Surfer being sad about this and Dawn sort of bringing him out of his shell. I mean, as ever in Marvel Comics, there's the weird timeline thing. Like, the stuff with Galactus, realistically, that was all stuff that happened in the Silver Surfer's, like, earliest appearances in, like, early Fantastic Four comics in the 60s. So, really, writing him like he's just stepped out of that story is to skip about 5 or 6 decades of character development at this point. But because the Silver Surfer's not really a character who's constantly in use, people do tend to sort of jump back to this quite archetypal, he's a man haunted by his decisions when he works for Galactus incarnation of him when they write him, even though it's been decades. A lot of different writers have written various iterations of the Silver Surfer finally gets over the Galactus thing. I have moderate confidence that when the Silver Surfer reappears in a few years with his next series, he'll probably still be haunted by his actions when he works for Galactus. And to be fair, I might be saying this like it's criticism, but, helping to destroy a load of whole planets is something you might be fairly haunted by. It might well follow you around for a fairly long time.
Resurface and things like that. I guess it's because it's the one thing that, like, everyone knows about the Silver Surfer. Like, say, even I've not particularly familiar with the character or the Fantastic Four, but just from a few 90s cartoons, the thing I know about him is that, he appears before Galactus, who eats planets.
Yeah, that's kind of why, that's the one basic bit of character background you can assume knowledge of, so you start from it and go from there.
Which I guess makes sense as a writer. You've got to work with what the audience knows, especially for, I guess, what you could describe as an obscure character, or at least a sort of second-tier character. I think at this point everyone knows what the deal with, like, Wolverine or Batman is, but maybe not for Silver Surfer.
He's probably a hard B or C list. I mean, to be honest, the Silver Surfer is the sort of character they probably have brought up for the Marvel Cinematic Universe around now. He's a level of character they're starting to get to at this point, if not for the fact that he's tied up in Fantastic Four rights, so obviously they've only just got the rights to him back. I'm sure he'll be along, but they're going to probably do the Fantastic Four first. But if they'd done the Fantastic Four years ago, like they might have done if they'd been able to, I wouldn't be surprised if we were seeing the Silver Surfer project about now.
I guess keep your eyes peeled for the end of credit sequence in the forthcoming Fantastic Four film for him to be introduced.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting. If they introduce the Silver Surfer, does that mean they're doing Silver Surfer, or does that mean they're doing Galactus in the next Fantastic Four film? Probably both, to be honest.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is, I think of the Silver Surfer series that have come out over the years, there are a few that have some kudos, but this is the first one in quite a while. Like, in the time I've been reading comics, there's only been one or two that have picked up a lot of heat, and this is definitely one of them. If what I've said sounds appealing to you, it's definitely the best possible version of that. I do heavily recommend it. Okay, and with that, Alastair, what have you been doing in the last fortnight, and is it watching a subtitled TV show?
It is not, in this case.
Holy fuck.
Well, I have been watching some subtitled TV because I never really stop. But what I'd like to talk to you about today is a new film I saw on Netflix, which is Stowaway, that came out very recently, starring Anna Kendrick, Toni Collette, Daniel Day Kim, and Shamir Anderson. It's got quite a simple premise. There are three astronauts, played by Kendrick, Collette, and Kim, and they are on the first manned mission to Mars, or crewed mission to Mars, I suppose I should say. And then they discover, when they are sort of away from Earth, that due to an accident, the character called Michael, played by Shamir Anderson, is on board, has unofficially stowed away because he was working on the ship, had some kind of accident, ended up getting stuck in part of the mechanism and was unconscious during all takeoff and things like that. And obviously they encounter the problem quite early on that the ship only has enough resources for 3 people to last the 2-year round trip to Mars. So what are they going to do about this? And yeah, it's a quite claustrophobic thriller. It all takes place in the small confines of their ship. The characters work on try how to tackle this problem and come up with various ideas, but there's this constant sense of danger sort of hanging over them, and this background tension because there's the very real prospect that if they can't sort this out, either one person's going to have to die or they're all going to die. So it's quite tense, so I'd recommend watching it.
So is this a sort of, I don't know if this is really something that applies to film, but what TV shows call a bottle episode, sort of a few people in a limited space, tight focus, what will they do? Yeah,
that's exactly it, yeah. So I guess it's a bottle film in that they are all in just this one location, and yeah, there's only like a handful of characters, and one of the interesting decisions they make is that they are kind of in radio contact with the base back on Earth to try and sort this out, but you never really hear what the base is saying or what they're doing. You only get the side of the conversation on the ship, so you get people speaking to microphones and you hear sort of half the conversation, which means interesting because you're trying to piece together what's been said, but also it means you're really focused on these characters, not anyone outside this bubble.
So there's no shots of worried-looking people at base standing there with tears in their eyes going, they did it.
No, none of that, yeah. And it kind of mentions like various things, like the character David, played by Daniel Day Kim. It mentions like he has a wife, but like she never appears or things like that. It's very focused on these characters. It's almost like a play. Wouldn't be too difficult to adapt this for stage, just 4 people in a small space.
Okay. And it's effective? You felt tension?
Yeah, it is very tense, yeah. And it's one of those things that like, all the characters are very sort of like nice, likable characters. Yeah, there's no, villain for the piece, and everyone's just sort of like quietly working to fix the problems. It's kind of got that sort of Martian vibe again with like the Matt Damon film and the Andy Weir book before it. You know, people sort of like calmly working to try and solve a problem, and you know, they're just all people in this unfortunate situation trying to sort it out. And you kind of really feel for the characters because they're all quite nice and they're all quite calm, even-tempered people, which I guess you need to be for a dangerous space flight, to be not the sort of person who panics easily. But there's still this sense of if they can't solve the problem, there's going to be some measure of death.
Yeah, but I guess the idea is the tension slowly wraps up. Like there's not like an alien stalking the ship and killing them one at a time, is there? There's just, the threat of death by lack of resources.
Yeah, and obviously it becomes more pressing over time. There are a few unexpected things that happen along the way, sort of emergencies that arise. It's probably best if you go into the film about these unspoilt, but there's definitely a sense of rising tension, and it kind of builds to quite intense climactic scene.
Yeah, no, it sounds good. I think it seems to have been quite well received. I've seen a couple of positive tweets. Netflix keep trying to get me to watch it.
Yeah, it's a weird one. I'm surprised it's not been better received. It's very good and I'd recommend it. Current Rotten Tomatoes score 77%. Very respectable. I do get the feeling this would have definitely been in the cinema had this, cinemas been open, at least open in the UK. It's got stars that's only big enough to open a film. Anna Kendrick, Toni Collette, Daniel Day-Kim, who's from Lost and quite a lot of other TV stuff. Shamir Anderson I'm not so familiar with, but he's very good in this film. So I can imagine this would have maybe made more of an impression had it been in the cinema, but I don't know if it's just been released on Netflix along with other films. That means it's kind of not really found its moment. Maybe there's only a limited amount of sci-fi people to watch in one weekend. Well, most people. I, however, we watch a lot of sci-fi in one weekend.
Look, it's lockdown. Surely, with nothing else, we've got time to watch infinite Netflix films.
So yeah, if you are scrolling through Netflix and wondering what to watch, this is a really good, tight, tense thriller with some good performances. Maybe not a relaxing, unwind watch, because it is quite tense, but it is certainly entertaining.
Okay, and first up this fortnight, to celebrate Alastair's successful Oscar predictions last episode, we will be covering Nomadland, the Best Picture winner for this year. This is a new film written and directed by Chloe Zhao, based on the book by Jessica Bruder, and it stars Frances McDormand as a woman whose husband dies and then the town they live in collapses, so she decides and or finds herself with little choice but to leave her home and become a modern day nomad. She travels around, she works various jobs, she meets a lot of other nomads, many of whom I think are played by real life nomads for playing fictionalised versions of themselves rather than actors. And yeah, it's a very slow, meditative, interesting film. We have both seen it, as it is on Disney Plus in the UK. Alastair, what did you think?
Well, it's not a very original take to say that the film that everyone says is good and has won loads of prizes is a good film. But that said, it's a good film. And yeah, I thought this was very powerful. It was engrossing. It's quite a quiet film. It's got a sort of sweet gentleness to it, that I quite liked. It's a sort of quiet film about loss and grieving. As you mentioned, like Fern's lost her husband. It doesn't have any like big emotional scenes to it, or like scenes that are kind of like emotionally bombastic. I mean, one of the most intense bits is when a man drops a box full of plates that break, that have emotional significance. That's one of the most emotionally intense bits of the film. There's no like big speeches but it is a sort of quietly emotional and sort of also quietly political film about modern America. So yeah, it's a sort of really nice, soft, gentle, interesting, quiet film.
Yeah, it's a character study. It's a gentle piece. I didn't actually know that the lot of the nomads were played by real life nomads. So although it was kind of unsurprising when I saw it in the credits, or when I realised that Swanky was credited as playing Swanky and stuff. And obviously, okay, I think that's happening. And I looked it up on the internet, and sure enough, yeah. But it didn't seem entirely surprising, because there's a strange semi-documentary feel to it at times. Like, it feels very soft. It feels like it could just be someone pointing a camera at reality, because as you say, it doesn't really go for any like dramatic peaks and troughs. Like, there's an ongoing sort of relationship between the main character Fern and this other nomad Dave, who clearly has taken a bit of a shine to her. And I don't know, I feel like in a lot of films that would be building to something, whether it's something horrific or just an emotional confrontation where Fern has to tell him she just doesn't feel that way about it, but it's kind of underplayed pretty heavily. They both seem to kind of know it, and she just sort of leaves, which is probably what would happen in real non-movie land. And it just sort of, all of this adds to this not that over dramatized, slow, gentle, real feeling to it.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, the relationship between them is very understated. Yeah, between Fern and Dave. And there is like a sort of climactic bit, I guess, when Fern goes to stay with his family, and there is like a sort of sense of character progression. And yeah, there is like a sort of arc to the story, and that leads back to the end, which it's not really a twist film, but let's avoid discussing the actual end. So there is some more traditional filmmaking aspects to this, the fact that there's a sort of character arc and dramatic arc, but as you say, it's quite understated. There's no kind of big confrontational moment. People kind of quietly get the vibe from each other and then sort of carry on down their road, which I guess is one of the themes of this film. Life is being constantly in motion, people kind of coming in and out of each other's lives across the journey of life.
There is a hint of a sort of standard filmic arc, like she, becomes a nomad, she hits the road, she meets this community of nomads, and for a while she thinks she's found her people, but slowly she realises it's not all fun and camaraderie being a nomad, there's a downside as well. That is, quite cinematic. A lot of films are like that, it just never really plays it in a very over-dramatic way.
Yeah, exactly. And I did really like the kind of documentary-esque, kind of blurring the lines between fiction and documentary that this film does. The way, it talks to, these people playing themselves, including one guy who's like a nomad YouTuber who, and the kind of big gathering they go to where people swap stuff and trade skills and things. And there are bits that are almost like when people are telling their stories to Fern or whatever that are just like very close to an interview in a documentary film than a scene from a work of fiction.
Yeah, I think it's showing their lives through a fairly clear lens. It ends up seeming very even-handed about the subject matter. Like, you definitely don't come away looking at Nomad life and thinking either, fuck yeah, that looks amazing, or, oh no, that looks awful. It's a very much sort of, well, it's a thing. It has upsides and downsides. It's a very... Again, it's not really a piece of journalism, but it does seem very invested in presenting it fairly even-handedly. It's not really throwing in any ludicrously dramatic bad things happening. It's just, here are the things that happen.
Yeah, very much so. And I think, you're right there. Like, it's not a film about someone finding sort of escape from their life or this like brilliant existence as a nomad, but it's also not one of those decline films when people join us, a community and it goes so far and then you realise there's like a dark underside to it. Because nothing quite so dramatic or bleak happens in this film. There is a real sense of bleakness woven through it. I guess it's a film about loss and depression, and it's all set in these kind of quite bleak, forbidding landscapes across America.
There is a sort of, it's not all candy and flowers, there is a downside bit in the sort of second half of the film, but it's not really portrayed as, oh no, it was all a fake, everything's a lie, big dramatic twist reveal of the dark side.
And I think that links to how the film is sort of quiet politics, in that it's presenting the world of these people who, a lot of them don't really have any choice but to live in their vans and live this nomad life. I mean, a lot of them are old people who basically can't retire because they don't have social security. I was struck by the nomad life, and the people there are all older boomers. There's no young people being like opting out of the system to live on the road, or people having like midlife crisis or whatever, or like people it's all just old people who basically can't retire and have no money and have to live in these vans. And I kind of really asking questions about like America, like what do we do with all these like poor old people, and why are people forced to live like this? And it's not really like bashing you over the head with these issues. It's just sort of quietly there for you to take in.
Yeah, there's one guy who's a bit younger, and I think at one point the lead character sort of asks him, what are you doing here? Yeah, there's a sort of standard bit of writing advice for like writing a scene, which is, get in late, get out early. Don't bore us, get to the chorus, just do the bit that's actually interesting. And this film is definitely a hard adherent to that. Like, it seems to often show the absolute bare minimum of almost every scene, to the point where any time where she has like an actual chat with someone for the benefit of building characterization almost seems like an outlier. A lot of the time they just cut in. She has the one exchange that actually advances the plot, then they cut out again. The film's more interested in showing like long, loving shots of scenery, which are gorgeous, by the way. Some beautiful looking shots of scenery. Than it is on, long conversations.
Yeah, and like lots of music as well. Like, there's a really nice score that sort of fits around it. Yeah, you are right that the photography is absolutely beautiful. I can see why Chloe Zhao won Best Director. Just absolutely phenomenal photography of American landscapes in this film, as well as, I mean, being a great director is not just shooting beautiful shots, which she does very well. It's, working with actors, bringing out the story and the characters, and she's obviously done amazing work getting these people to share their lives through a work of fiction. You get the sense she's sort of immersed in this community, understands it, really developed these stories. Yeah, definitely, absolutely justly deserved Best Director win.
Yeah, it almost seemed like a bit of an outlier for Best Picture, because a lot of the times when I've seen Best Picture films, they've been a bit more knowingly sort of mainstream and hooky. There's been more of a clear entertainment value or story concepts to suck you in. I don't know, they always seem a bit more designed for maximum appeal. Yeah, but Parasite's a very entertaining film. It's very creepy and funny. Whereas this, even though it's definitely a very good film, and I'm not qualified to judge if it should have won, because I haven't seen hardly any of the other nominees, I can fully believe it should win. I'm in some ways surprised I actually chose it.
Yeah, well, I've seen all of the Best Picture nominees apart from The Father, and I would say this is the best. It was a very good year. I mean, across the board, lots of strong things. Like, I really liked The Sound of Metal, that kind of got a bit less attention direction than the others. And, we discussed on this podcast how much we liked Trial of the Chicago 7. It's been a strong year for Oscars. It was a very good slate. But of them all, this one I think had something special, which is why I won, in that partly it's that blurring of documentary and fiction is quite unusual. Partly it's a film that feels like it has something to say, but also isn't quite as overt about what it has to say. I mean, I did really like Trial of the Chicago 7, but that is a film that says what it has to say loud and clear. I mean, it's a different approach. One approach isn't better than the other, but this one is very much sort of it's quietly weaving in politics into this kind of story. Frances McDormand does a great performance. I did really think this was probably the strongest Oscar film and deserved the prizes it walked away with.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a very clear vision. It's definitely a singular work of art, but it feels like it's been very honed to perfection. So yeah, I agree. I respect the craft of Nomadland.
The one criticism I've seen people talk about it is that although it's got there's quite this quiet politics running through it, and it's brings in Amazon and the scarcity of jobs and the seasonal work and things. There's someone said that there's a just sort of striking absence of Trump or sort of Republican angry politics. And again, a lot of these kind of poor blue-collar Americans, that's the sort of people Trump really appealed to, people who felt that they've been cheated by the system and by wealthy people. And yeah, I've read this criticism, and yeah, it's the sort of thing. There are definitely, I can imagine, people here who would get on board with Trump and things like that. No one's really flying Confederate flags or whatever, and I'm sure there's some nomads who identify with the Confederacy. I think including any of that would just be too on the nose. It would be too Trump's appealing to the forgotten America. It would just be a bit too straight up than this film does. But I do see that criticism that it is an element of poverty in America that is overlooked. So I guess there's a validity to the criticism.
Yes, I do think that ultimately specific politics just isn't something this film's interested in. Amazon is in it, but they're not portrayed as evil or anything. They're there as a realistic job that someone who desperately needs a job might get, but they're not portrayed as a complete evil soul-sucking corporation. If anything, to be honest, considering how prominent the discourse about Amazon treats its workers like garbage has been in the last year or so, it's a bit strange to see her working at Amazon and there be no commentary whatsoever on whether it's a good place to work. It's just a place she trundles along working. Whether we can take from that the undercurrents that actually all jobs are kind of bad, or whether Chloe Zhao just didn't want to talk about that, I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right that, the Amazon thing relates to the sort of Trump or blue-collar America identity issue, which is, this film is not trying to make a specific point about specific employer or politician, or it's kind of more showing you this life and leaving you to draw your own kind of conclusions from it. Yeah,
I mean, the closest to a criticism I've seen of Nomadland is some people have found it a bit dull. And, I can sort of imagine that. It's not the most dynamic of films. If you're someone who mostly watches, fictional films, it's not a film that necessarily hits the drama that hard. It does almost have more of a documentary vibe, and there are, a lot of people out there who just don't watch documentaries.
Yeah, it is a quiet, slow film, so again, if you're sort of exhausted at the end of the week, it's sort of a hugely entertaining thing to put on. A friend of mine did say that they fell asleep watching it, and because it's quite a slow, gentle film with a soft piano soundtrack, and it's very beautiful, but it's got a vibe, and I can see why if you're not in for the quiet vibe, then it's not necessarily your thing. But I guess a lot of this film, it is what it is, and you kind of have to take it as a package.
Yeah, it's not really interested in sticking out big dramatic hooks for you to grab onto, so as it could lull you gently off to sleep, and you can have dreams of the open road.
Just drop the needle on Blue Oyster Cult at this point. Credits roll.
Try and find some copyright-free music to drive to. Okay, and second up today, we'll be talking about Way of X, a new X-Men spin-off book written by Cy Spurrier, drawn by Bob Quinn, coloured by Yava Tartaglia, and lettered by Clayton Cowles, with a cover by Giuseppe Camuncoli. This is a new series following the X-Men character Nightcrawler, who, after starting to have some concerns about the Krakoa experiment, where the X-Men all live on a tropical island paradise by themselves, where they have conquered death and can just party forever. But he starts to worry, is it bad that they've lost all respect for death? Are some of these rituals a bit weird? Do they need a more spiritual side? And what, if anything, is he going to do about it? This was also set up in X-Men issue 7, which I did get Alastair to read because I felt it did a lot of the groundwork leading into this issue, which is by Jonathan Hickman and Lionel Francis Yu. So yes, we have read both those comics, although, just to be clear, the main one we're reviewing is Way of X. Alastair, What did you think of this?
Yes, this is a really interesting story. It's certainly intriguing. It does one of the things that I really like from a sci-fi story, which is that it uses a sci-fi premise, in this case the sort of resurrection, X-Men conquering death, to explore some deep philosophical and spiritual issues to do with, death, religion, the soul, the quite sort of big things they're taking on here. But the conversations between the characters sort of feel natural, and it doesn't come across as like kind of artificially shoehorning in these big, deep issues into a work of fiction just to make a point. I guess partly a lot of the comic is a conversation between Nightcrawler, who's a priest, and Professor X, who's not only a political leader, but almost like a spiritual figurehead for the X-Men. So it makes sense they would have these kind of discussions, especially when these sort of issues play on their minds. For something that, like, you'd say, like, it's about death and the soul and things like that, it is actually very entertaining as well. So yeah, so good.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. It's an interesting counterpoint, because obviously this is Way of X, and we've already read House of X and Powers of 10, or Powers of X if you don't know the clever naming gimmick. It comes across as another comic in that sequence, although it's not written by Jonathan Hickman. In fact, if anything, it's a bit of an interesting counterpoint to Jonathan Hickman, who likes to throw out these big ideas, and one of the reasons he's quite good as a sort of lead writer for the line is he has a lot of these big ideas which he puts out there and does the basic setup for, and it leaves a lot for other writers like Cy Spurrier to explore, which is what I think is being done quite interestingly here. And Nightcrawler is a very well chosen character for this, because he's a priest, which has been long established in continuity. I can't remember if he was a priest in X-Men 2 or just religious, but yeah, Nightcrawler being religious has long been a thing. And he's also this sort of quite fun swashbuckling character. Like, he's considering deep issues of the soul or whatever, but he's not a bummer. It's not a comic about the sad, troubled male character slumping around going, I need to have a think, and then just sitting in a page covered in captions while he has his long, hard think.
Yeah, this isn't Hamlet.
Yeah.
In a good way.
Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, nothing really stands a favourable comparison to Hamlet.
In many ways, Way of X is better than Hamlet.
Shorter, it's definitely shorter.
You only read one issue, mate. There'll be more. But yeah, it's interesting, if only because a lot of the other X-Men comics have not really dug that much into some of the slightly disturbing aspects of the Krakoa stuff. Like, a lot of people have read some of the House of X, Powers of 10 stuff and thought, are these guys a cult? Is this weird? Is this creepy? On their weird island? Killing each other and coming back. Yeah, and I think at this point in the line it's a good time for someone to dig into that. And although obviously a lot of this first issue is asking questions, and with that sort of setup, you sort of then think, okay, what are the answers going to be? Is this comic going to be allowed to really deconstruct the setup or move things on? But yeah, it's playing an interesting role in asking these questions and saying, is some of this bad? Is some of this weird? Is some of this depressing, strange, or unhealthy? And yeah, it's asking them interestingly, and it's demonstrating them well. There's the action sequence towards the beginning where one of the young mutant characters just sort of decides it's her turn to try out death now that they can just die and come back. It's a very well balanced sort of swing from cheerful to disturbing, which happens quite quickly and is very effectively done.
Yeah, there's a character called Pixie who is a pixie, which adds this kind of slightly, I don't know, like almost twee element to the extremely macabre, which is, there's something about that's very, the contradiction makes it quite a uncanny sort of experience. It's a bizarre state of mind to get into. I can see why it would trouble, a deep thinker like Nightcrawler.
It's interesting for a superhero comic, but this doesn't feel like it's aggressively trying to lay out, the status quo or set up a team. I mean, there are some characters who feel like they're going to come back. Like, Dr. Nemesis looks like he's being set up to play a part. And maybe the character Lost and maybe Pixie? I don't know. It feels like those characters might be continuing to be involved. But yeah, it feels more like the start of a story than the establishment of a status quo.
Absolutely, yeah. And I guess there'll be an arc to this. They're also introducing several mysteries, including a character called the Jigsaw Man that people are seeing into dreams and visions, especially like children, who's kind of got this sort of sense of almost like a night terror that maybe like stalking them and possibly come to life. We're not sure if this is related to the death cult aspect or something that's disconnected. And there's definitely a sense that that's unfolding.
Yeah, and there's another character who appears towards the end who is a cliffhanger, so I guess I probably shouldn't spoil. But it's a character we have mentioned before on this podcast, more than you'd expect for an X-Men comics character.
Yeah, I mean, that was very good and an unexpected twist. So yeah, which was a nice, intriguing end. So yeah, it's always, I guess like obviously an issue of a comic is very much like an episode of a TV show. A good writer will save there to to be some kind of dramatic revelation for the final few moments that sends the story off in a new direction, and it does that very well.
Yeah, but as someone who occasionally tries to write comics, I've read a lot of bits about, what makes the good first issue of a comic, and there's always the idea that you should have your premise, which you can sell the issue with, and have something else that actually happens in the first issue, so people aren't just reading, a dramatized version of the marketing copy, basically.
Yeah, and a lot of pilot episodes for TV shows fail to do that. They just kind of have status quo and that's it.
Yeah, and the involvement of the person who shows up towards the end of this issue, do I need to be twee about this? I'm going to anyway. With respect, I spoil your story and not spoil it, is clearly going to change things. Whether this is a character who's going to be, the other major presence in the story going forward, he could easily be, or whether this is just, someone who's going to be around for the first few issues as a sort of first storyline, I don't know, but I'm intrigued enough to come back and find out.
Yeah, and also in terms of bringing in sort of broader characters from the X-Men and Marvel continuity, there's a few references dropped to Wanda Maximoff. Obviously, we most recently saw in WandaVision, but this is a very different Wanda.
Yeah, I did wonder when I set you the assignment of reading X-Men 7 and then this. Did the exposition all come across okay for that? You got what Wanda Maximoff was meant to have done in the past?
Yeah, it makes sense that she used her magic or her Scarlet Witch powers, which I guess are X-Men powers in the X-Men comics, whereas they're not in the Marvel continuity. She used her X-Men powers to take powers away from 1 million mutants, I believe is what's happened. But now, because they've conquered death, if these mutants die and get resurrected, they can have their powers back, which I think has led to the a kind of obsession with death and rebirth, and especially violent death, which obviously is disturbing Kurt.
Yeah, fair enough, that's it, yeah. Yeah, instead of just waiting for them to die or even just letting them kill themselves quietly, they've set up this sort of ritualised crucible thing, which is what Kurt finds disturbing. And to be fair, when X-Men 7 first came out, because there was a considerable gap between X-Men 7 and Way of X, like at least a year or two, I think, people were reading X-Men 7 and going, actually, is this disturbing? Is this whole Krakoa thing a bit cult-like and weird? That was one of the issues that really started that dialogue going, so It's nice that Way of X has now come along to continue it.
Yeah, I guess that relates to what you were saying of like Jonathan Hickman creating these worlds of which, like a sandbox that full of ideas and story concepts that other writers can pick up and run with.
Yeah, there are about 10 X-Men comics at this point, so yeah, it's definitely a setup that they're doing quite well with. So yeah, this was a really good, strong first issue. The art is very strong and clear. I think it's, as I say, there's a lot of chatting in this comic. Apart from maybe the opening action sequence and a couple of other scattered bits of action throughout, there's a lot of contemplative, theoretical conversations, and the comic does a good job of making them still dynamic, making the subtle emotions come through, keeping it moving, keeping it exciting to look at. So yeah, a very well executed book from beginning to end.
Yeah, one of the other key notes I have is that the art is beautiful, and it does a good job of capturing abstract concepts. Again, this is a comic where people are discussing death, the soul, immortality, philosophy, but there needs to be a way to make it visually interesting. It can't just be people sat in a room chatting, and the art is doing, I think, a lot of the work to make it visually interesting and engaging.
Yeah, there's a lot in here. I mean, it's a 40-page first issue, to be fair, or 40-ish page, maybe a bit less than that once you take out the cover and a few assorted bits and bobs. There's the traditional X-book data pages, which I think are put to good use here. Sometimes, in some of the books, because as I say, there's like 10 of these things now, and I've read quite a lot of them because I just subscribe to Marvel Unlimited to follow the X-books. Sometimes it does feel like they're just doing them because they're kind of part of the X-Men format at the moment, but there's some good use of them here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I always thought they enhanced the story for the bits that we've read before, because this one's their kind of extracts from Nightcrawler's sort of journal, or his kind of possible sort of like religious text that he's working on or something like that, or possibly something that he wrote that later became a religious text. So yeah, which is interesting. You get insight into his mind if this is like his private thoughts.
Yeah, the ambiguity of that's kind of interesting, like the fact that we don't for sure know what this mysterious book that's being quoted from in the data pages actually is. I mean, when this comic was first announced, X-Men number 7 came out a while ago, and it had this conversation between Nightcrawler and Cyclops when Nightcrawler says, I think I may need to start a mutant religion, which a lot of people sort of assumed was going to be the obvious, like, massive jumping off point of this comic. And when you read Way of X, it kind of both is and isn't. Like, he's clearly still thinking about the same things, but whenever anyone says, so what, you going to start a religion or something, he goes, yeah, I'm not sure how though. It's weird. It's clearly jumping off it, but at the same time, it always feels like it's walking it back a bit or something. It has a strange relationship to that line. Yeah,
I assume that's something they're going to develop in future issues, the story. But obviously, you've got the data pages, which are, you don't have no idea about how they're related to the main text. You know that they basically contain Nightcrawler's private thoughts, but there's an element of like, what angle are they viewing from? Are they being read many, many years later when his private thoughts have become some kind of book, sort of journal, the way that, various letters that St. Paul wrote became like part of the Bible, or, Marcus Aurelius, whose private thoughts in journal became a sort of philosophical, spiritual text. Lots of people have written down their private thoughts, deep thinkers, and later they've taken on a life on their own as a sort of story or narrative or work of philosophy. So you assume there's that, but you don't know how far removed it is, or whether these were collected by Nightcrawler with that intention or by someone else later. I guess there's a kind of exploration of texts going on there, which links back to the idea of, he wants to start a religion, he's talking about spirituality, have these ideas become the foundation of some kind of text at some point. But there's a sense of ambiguity. I mean, it's possible that this will be explained, that what these pages are and what this book is will be explained in a later issue, or is it a sort of a mystery that will be left hanging? Who knows?
I mean, a lot of the people whose work ends up being used that way might end up happening after they are dead, which is, I don't know, again, interesting to see if they'll end up going that way.
Yeah, well, there's certainly that. Again, that is a sort of presence in it. When you start reading a sort of a spiritual text by someone, it does make you think that they've passed on. So, yeah, that's creating this sort of sense of dramatic tension there.
Yeah, the unspoken question, will Nightcrawler survive? I mean, again, there's some hints in this issue about, the questions of who's being prioritised for resurrection. I can't remember if it was in House of X, Powers of 10, so I don't remember if you've read it, but there was a plot point about there being no precognitive mutants on Krakoa.
Yeah, I do remember that being mentioned.
Yeah, so there are certain people who just aren't being resurrected for thinly veiled reasons, like the character Blindfold, who's mentioned towards the end of this issue, is, I think, being left dead for that reason.
Yeah.
So they may be digging into that as well.
There is also a bit when they say, why hasn't someone been brought back? I can't remember who. And then someone makes a joke, there's quite a queue. There's a lot of people who want to resurrect. But it's sort of said in a sense of, this is a thinly veiled excuse. People say oh, X hasn't been brought back because there's a queue, you've just got to wait. But then there's a sense of, but someone's making decisions about who's brought back and who's not. And it's not really clear what criteria they're basing this on. And obviously what purpose their selection is doing. So there's this sense of is this fair? Is it this process being used to serve someone, maybe Professor X's political end? So again, there's another sense of there's something there. There's a tension to be explored.
Yeah, as it's hopefully coming across, it's a very interesting comic in terms of asking these key questions about the status quo. I'm definitely going to read more of it, so I guess it's got me there.
Yeah, me too. I want to find out where this goes.
I mean, if you like X-Men comics, you may well also be reading X-Men comics. The numbers available suggest a lot of people are. But yeah, this is definitely another good one. If you're keeping your X-Men reading limited, I would recommend adding this one. I think it has potential to be one of the good ones.
That's all we have time for today. If you have enjoyed this episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, then please leave us a review in your podcatcher of choice. If you want more from us, then you can visit our website, moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can listen to back issues of the podcast, bonus audio clips, and short written pieces. If you go there now, you can read Tom Coley, looking back at the seminal albums of the early noughts, and myself talking about German TV drama We Are the Wave, and what it says about digital activism.
And me doing nothing, because I'm very much the drag on the team. You can also get more by following the podcast on Twitter at MFV Podcast, or by finding it on Facebook as Moderate Fantasy Violence. Thank you very much. And if you want still more from me, I've been Nick Bryan. You can find me on Twitter as @NickMB, and I'm on Facebook at Nick Bryan Writes. There's more information about my writing and such at nickbryan.com.
I've been Alastair Ball. You can find more from me by following me on Twitter, where I'm at AlastairJRBall, and you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com. Join us next time on Moderate Fantasy Violence, when we will be reviewing the second series of Netflix's Love, Death and Robots, and The Mitchells vs. the Machines, a new film from the creators of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. See you then for that. Until then, goodbye.
Bye. Try and find some copyright-free music to drive to. Yeah,
something that's a bit like the classic kind of driving songs. Yeah, Don't Fear the Reaper or Born to Be Wild or something like that.
Played on a MIDI keyboard and distorted the shit.
Yeah, like our old ringtone.